My name is Ren Calloway. For 8 years, I had been the person companies quietly relied on when things went sideways. Deadlines slipping, teams falling apart, revenue bleeding out. I was the one who stepped in, mapped the problem, and fixed it without making a scene. No politics. No drama. Just results. Most of the time, nobody remembered my name by the end of it. I had made my peace with that. But for 6 months leading up to that Thursday morning, I had been building something different. Something bigger. A proposal that could completely change the way our company handled its client model, cutting operational waste, increasing retention rates, and opening a revenue stream that didn't yet exist in our industry. I had tested every assumption. I had run every number 3 times. I had prepared for every hard question. So when the HR director looked up from her notes, gave me a thin smile, and said the word unrealistic, something inside me cracked open. And nothing was ever the same after that. She didn't even let me finish the 3rd slide. Her name was Ms. Hargrove, the kind of person who sat at the head of tables and made other people feel like they were wasting her time just by existing. She held up one hand and said, "I'm going to stop you right there." The room went quiet. Not the supportive quiet of people thinking carefully. The careful quiet of people avoiding eye contact. I asked her as steadily as I could manage, what specifically seemed unrealistic. She finally looked directly at me, a long, appraising look, the kind that measures and dismisses at the same time. She said it was too big, too disruptive. And then she added the part that burned the longest. "Frankly, it's not aligned with your role." Someone at the table laughed softly. Not cruelly, just the reflex laugh of someone who wanted to signal they were on the right side of the room. Miss Hargrove gathered her papers. "Let's focus on what you were actually hired to do." The meeting moved on, and I sat there holding 6 months of work in my hands like it weighed nothing. I was not supposed to be the person who had that idea. I was a mid-level product strategist at Colvane Group, a company that made reliable, unspectacular software for mid-market logistics firms. I was the person managers looped in at the last minute when something needed untangling. Not because they respected my judgment exactly, but because I was reliable and I didn't complain and I got things done without requiring much management. For 6 months, I had been building the proposal on my own time. Evenings. Weekends. Early mornings before anyone else arrived at the office. Not because I expected a promotion or a bonus. Because I had seen a genuine gap in the way our company structured its client relationships, and I had figured out how to close it. The model I built could reduce client churn by projecting contract risk 12 months in advance. It could cut internal processing waste by consolidating 3 redundant workflows into one. It could generate new revenue by offering the framework to third-party partners as a licensed product. I had thought about nothing else for 6 months, and I had just been told it didn't fit my role. After the meeting, nobody spoke to me. My manager, a careful man named Phil Osei, who had built his entire career around never being in the wrong room, gave me a brief practice smile as we filed out. He said, "Good effort. Maybe dial it back next time." I nodded. I walked back to my desk. I sat down and opened my email and stared at it without reading a single word. That evening I sat in my car in the parking structure for almost 45 minutes, my laptop open on the passenger seat, the presentation still on the screen. I had one hand on the trackpad, ready to drag the whole folder to the trash. I sat there long enough that the parking structure light cycled through one full automated dim. Then I closed the laptop without deleting anything. I drove home. I made dinner I didn't taste. And I told myself that the rejection was just one person's opinion, and that one person's opinion was not the same as the truth. I almost believed it. But something else was already sitting in the back of my mind that I hadn't named yet, a feeling that the room had been too quiet, and that some of that quiet had felt less like boredom and more like attention. 2 weeks later, I saw the memo. It arrived in a company-wide internal email from the strategic planning department, flagged as a new initiative under review by senior leadership. It was titled Project Horizon. The summary described a client retention framework built around predictive contract risk analysis, consolidated workflow integration, and a licensing model for third-party deployment. I read it twice with the particular focused stillness that comes when your brain is trying to confirm something it doesn't want to be true. Then I opened my own proposal document, still saved in its original folder with its original timestamp, and read them side by side. The names were different. The formatting was different. But the structure was the same. The logic was the same. 3 of the section headers used nearly identical phrasing to my own. And buried in the third appendix of Project Horizon, in a table of projected client risk indicators, was a specific calculation error that I had made in an early draft, one I had caught and corrected in my final version, but which had apparently been copied before I made the fix. They had my draft. They had taken my draft. I went to Phil first. I closed the door of his office, kept my voice level, and told him I needed to show him something. I pulled up both documents on my laptop and walked him through the parallels systematically. I was not emotional. I was precise. I pointed to the section headers, the structural framework, the calculation error that matched my early draft exactly. Phil leaned back in his chair slowly, with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had already decided how it would end. He said I needed to be very careful making claims like that. I said I wasn't making claims. I was showing him documented evidence. He said that ideas developed organically inside organizations, and that it was easy to see patterns where none existed. I started to respond. He cut me off with the one word I had been dreading. "You're being emotional, Ren." The conversation was over. I understood that clearly. Not because he had answered anything, but because his willingness to use that word told me exactly how this would be handled if I kept pushing from the inside. HR called me in the following morning. Miss Hargrove was behind the desk. Same smile. She said Phil had mentioned I had some concerns and that she wanted to make sure I felt heard. I sat down and walked her through everything again. The timestamps on my files, the email chain showing when I had shared early drafts internally, the specific calculation error that matched. She listened with the patient, interested expression of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for you to finish. When I was done, she nodded slowly and said, "Ideas evolve inside organizations. Nobody really owns an idea." Then she leaned forward slightly and said in a softer voice designed to sound like guidance, "You don't want to damage your reputation over this." I looked at her for a long moment. There was nothing in her face that resembled discomfort. She had said it the way someone says it when they have practiced it, when they have used that exact sentence before and found that it works. It was not advice. It was a boundary marker. Stay here. Go no further. I thanked her and left. After the HR meeting, things at Culvane changed in the specific, quiet way that organizations punish people without leaving fingerprints. I stopped receiving invitations to strategy calls I had previously attended regularly. My input on 2 ongoing projects was redirected. Requests that used to come to me directly now went to other team members instead. A colleague I trusted, a woman named Petra, pulled me aside near the coffee station one afternoon and whispered that people were describing me as difficult. Not in any official context. Just in the way the word gets passed around hallways and lunch tables until it becomes the first thing people think when they hear your name. Difficult. For noticing. For asking a documented question with documented evidence. For not thanking the room for telling me my work wasn't mine. I went home that evening and sat with it. And I understood, clearly and without drama, what was actually happening. They were not just taking the idea. They were building a case for removing the person who had built it, so that by the time the idea succeeded there would be no inconvenient history to explain. I did not quit. I did not escalate. I did not send any emails I would later need to explain. Instead, I got very quiet and very methodical. I had spent 8 years fixing problems for other people, and I understood better than most that the solution to any problem starts with accurate information. So I started collecting it. Every email that touched my original proposal. Sent. Received. Forwarded. Every version of my working documents with their automatic timestamps intact. Screenshots of the internal Project Horizon memo with its date stamp. The calculation error, documented side by side with my draft, saved in 3 separate locations. I was not doing this out of anger. I was doing it the way I did everything, because the evidence mattered, and because I had learned early that the people who win the long argument are the ones who kept the receipts. I worked my regular hours. I did my regular work. I smiled at the right times and stayed invisible at the right times. And every evening I went home and added to a folder I had labeled, with no particular drama, reference. A month after the memo, leadership presented Project Horizon to the full company in a rollout meeting. I sat near the back. Phil presented the framework with the relaxed confidence of someone who had been given something already built and only needed to learn the vocabulary. Miss Hargrove sat in the front row nodding approvingly. I watched the slides go by, my structure, my logic, my categories, and I felt something unexpected. Not the anger I had anticipated. Something colder and more clarifying. Because as Phil presented, I started to notice the gaps. They had taken the surface of my proposal, the terminology, the framework labels, the visual structure. But they had not understood the reasoning underneath it. The system I had designed worked because of specific sequencing, because each component activated the next in a particular order that I had tested carefully. Phil's version had rearranged several elements in ways that looked tidy on a slide, but would cause the whole model to lag at the critical retention prediction stage. They had copied the blueprint without understanding the architecture. And that meant Project Horizon, as presented, was going to fail. At the end of the presentation, Phil invited questions and feedback. He looked at me once, just briefly, with the particular look of someone giving a test. I smiled pleasantly. I raised no questions. I offered no corrections. For the first time in 8 years at Colvane, I sat in a room full of problems I could see clearly and I said nothing. It felt strange. It also felt like something releasing. I had spent nearly a decade catching other people's errors and quietly fixing them without recognition. I had done it because I thought results were what mattered, and that if I produced enough of them, the value would eventually speak for itself. Sitting in the back of that room, watching Phil present a broken version of my idea with complete confidence, I understood something I probably should have understood years earlier. Results only speak for themselves to the people who are listening. Colvane was not listening. And for the first time, I stopped trying to make them hear. The recruiter's message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon via a professional network platform while I was eating lunch at my desk. I almost didn't read it. I had been getting occasional recruiter messages for years and had ignored all of them. I was not the kind of person who chased moves, and the disruption of changing companies had always seemed like more trouble than it was worth. I read the first line out of habit and then stopped. The company name was Orlan Systems. I set down my fork. Orlan was Colvane's largest competitor, bigger, better funded, and in the past 2 years increasingly aggressive about expanding its client base into exactly the mid-market logistics space that Colvane dominated. I stared at the message for a while. The recruiter said they were looking for someone with a background in product strategy and client model innovation. Those were not generic words. I read the message again. Then I closed my lunch container, put it back in the fridge, and returned to my desk and typed one sentence: I'm open to a conversation. The first interview at Orlan felt like walking into a different atmosphere. The room was smaller and less formal than Colvane's meeting rooms, a round table, no presentation screen, for people who introduced themselves by first name and then asked me a question and actually waited for the full answer before responding. The head of product strategy was a direct, quick-thinking woman named Nadia Obesai. She asked me within the first 10 minutes to describe a problem I had identified in a previous role that the organization hadn't been able to solve. I described a version of my framework, carefully, without using any proprietary Colvane data, without referencing any internal documents. I described the thinking, how client churn could be predicted 12 months out using contract behavior patterns, how consolidating specific workflows could reduce processing friction, how the framework could be licensed externally as a standalone product. The room went quiet. Not the dismissive quiet I had learned at Colvane. A focused, forward-leaning quiet. The quiet of people doing rapid mental calculations about what they had just heard. Nadia looked at her colleagues. Then she looked back at me. Walk us through the sequencing, she said. I was careful throughout that conversation and every conversation that followed with Orlan. I did not share a single document from Colvane. I did not reference any internal data, any client names, any proprietary systems or processes. I shared only what I had built from my own thinking, the logic, the framework structure, the sequencing principles I had developed. These things were mine. They had lived in my head before they ever touched a Colvane server. The distinction mattered legally and it mattered to me personally because I was not interested in winning by doing something I would have to hide later. What I brought to Orlin was the mind that had built the model, and it turned out that was the part Colvane had never understood was the valuable thing. They had taken the document. They had not taken the understanding. Nadia and her team pushed back on my ideas intelligently and specifically, which improved my thinking rather than deflating it. Every question they asked was one I had either already answered or was glad to work through. By the third conversation, I understood that the framework I had built in Colvane's margins was about to get the environment it had always needed. Orlin made me a formal offer 10 days after my first interview. The salary was significantly higher than what I was earning at Colvane. The title was Head of Client Strategy, a leadership role rather than a mid-level one. But neither of those things was what made me sit very still for a long moment after opening the offer letter. There was an equity component. A meaningful one. Orlin wasn't just offering me a job. They were offering me a stake in what I built, a percentage tied specifically to the performance of the client model initiative they wanted me to lead. They had put a number on my contribution before I had contributed anything. That was the thing that Colvane had never done in 8 years. They had taken everything I built and returned nothing but a salary and a job title that didn't reflect what I actually did. Orlin was saying something different. They were saying, "We think what you build will be worth something, and we want you to share in that." I read the offer letter 3 times. Then I called my solicitor to review it. Then I signed. I resigned from Colvane on a Wednesday morning. I had written my resignation letter 4 times, each draft slightly shorter than the last, until the final version was 3 sentences. I was resigning effective in 2 weeks. I was grateful for the opportunities, and I wished the team well. No reference to Project Horizon. No reference to Ms. Hargrove or Phil, or the meeting where my idea had been called unrealistic. No speech. No final confrontation. I printed it, walked to Phil's office, and handed it to him. He read it, looked up, and said he was sorry to see me go. I said I appreciated that. Ms. Hargrove's assistant sent me an automated offboarding form. In my last 2 weeks, I wrapped up my active projects cleanly, documented everything for whoever would take it over, and left no loose ends. On my last day, Ms. Hargrove passed me in the corridor and offered a brief smile, the same one she had always used, and said, "We wish you the best." She had no idea where I was going. She had no idea what I was taking with me. I smiled back and kept walking. I started at Orlin on a Monday and spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but listening. I attended every relevant meeting, read every piece of documentation I could access, and asked questions without offering many answers. I needed to understand Orlin's actual infrastructure before I rebuilt my framework inside it, the specific systems they used, the particular friction points in their client pipeline, the gaps between what their sales team promised and what their delivery team could support. What I found was a company that was capable and ambitious but had been operating a client model that was fundamentally reactive. They responded to churn after it happened. They had no system for predicting it. The framework I had designed at Colvane was built precisely for that problem, and Orlin's infrastructure was, in several important ways, a better fit for it than Colvane's had ever been. I rebuilt the model from the ground up, incorporating everything Nadia's team had challenged me on during the interview process. Every weak point I had identified in the original version got addressed. By the end of week 3, I had something better than what I had started with. Significantly better. We launched the first phase 4 months after I arrived at Orlin, a controlled rollout with 12 existing clients selected for their diversity of contract size and industry. Nadia's team had been skeptical about the timeline, which was tighter than standard, but I had built enough contingency into the model that I was confident we could absorb variance. The framework's first function was the predictive risk scoring, flagging clients whose contract behavior patterns indicated elevated churn probability 12 months out. We ran it against the 12 pilot clients and then cross-referenced the results against Orlin's existing client success data. The alignment was strong. The model flagged 3 clients as high risk. Orlin's internal records showed that 2 of those 3 had already been internally categorized as watchlist accounts. The third was a surprise. A long-standing client who appeared stable by conventional metrics, but whose contract behavior showed specific early indicators my model was designed to catch. Nadia looked at the results for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This is real." I said I knew. The results from the 12-client pilot came in over the following 8 weeks. Client retention among the flagged high-risk accounts improved significantly. 2 of the 3 were retained through early intervention strategies triggered by the model's predictions. The consolidated workflow integration reduced internal processing time by 31% across the pilot group. The third-party licensing concept, which Nadia had initially been most skeptical about, attracted serious interest from 2 logistics software firms within weeks of a quiet industry briefing. A trade publication ran a piece on predictive retention modeling in mid-market logistics that didn't name Orlen specifically, but described a framework that matched ours closely enough that people in the industry began asking questions. Then a larger outlet picked up the story. Then a business podcast requested an interview with Nadia, who mentioned her head of client strategy by name. I had spent 8 years making sure nobody knew my name. Suddenly, people in my industry were looking it up. I heard about Colvane's Project Horizon failing from Petra. She had stayed in touch, sending occasional brief messages that were professional enough to be deniable if anyone asked. She texted me on a Thursday afternoon. Horizon is in trouble. Clients not responding. Costs up. Fill in emergency meetings all week. I was not surprised. The sequencing flaw I had spotted during the rollout presentation had done what flaws do when nobody corrects them. It had compounded. The model's retention predictions were arriving too late in the client lifecycle to trigger effective intervention, which meant the whole system was generating accurate data that nobody had time to act on. It was a timing problem embedded in the architecture, and without understanding why the original sequencing mattered, there was no obvious place to look for the error. I read Petra's text and thought about the version of myself that had sat in the back of that rollout meeting, watching Phil present a broken framework with full confidence. I had known then. I had said nothing. I felt no particular satisfaction about it now, just a clean, factual sense that what I had always believed had turned out to be true. The work was the work. Quality was not a matter of opinion. A former colleague named Bo sent me a message about 3 weeks after Petra's text. He was someone I had worked with for 5 years and trusted without question. He wrote, "Ren, they just figured out where the framework came from. Someone pulled the original timeline. There's a meeting happening right now about it." I sat with that message for a while. I thought about what it would feel like to respond with something pointed, something that reminded him, and by extension everyone in that meeting, of the Thursday morning when I had been told my idea didn't fit my role. But I didn't feel pointed. I felt, honestly, very little. Not the numb nothing of suppression, but the clean nothing of a chapter that has genuinely ended. Their recognition of what had happened didn't change anything that had already been built. It didn't add to what I had at Orlen. It didn't restore the 6 months of evenings and weekends I had spent building something they had dismissed in 10 minutes. It was simply information, arriving late, the way information often does when people have been too comfortable to look for it sooner. I replied to Bo, "Thanks for telling me," and went back to work. Ms. Hargrove called me on a Friday afternoon. I saw the number, Colvane's main line, and answered because I was curious rather than because I had any particular hope for the conversation. Her voice was different from every previous version of it I had heard. The practiced smoothness was still there, but underneath it something had been replaced by calculation of a more urgent kind. She said Colvane would love to bring me back in some capacity, perhaps as a consultant, to help course-correct the current strategic initiative. She used the word consultant very carefully, the way you use a word when you are trying to avoid a more accurate one. I asked her what specifically they needed help with. She said they had encountered some implementation challenges with Project Horizon. I said, "What kind of challenges?" She described, in careful professional language, exactly the sequencing flaw I had identified at the rollout meeting. I said, "I see." There was a brief silence. Then she said she thought we might be able to find a mutually beneficial arrangement. I told her I would think about it and call her back. I was not going to call her back without talking to a solicitor first. But I was also, for the first time, thinking about what the right price for that conversation actually was. I went back to Colvane's building 3 weeks later. I had spoken to my solicitor twice, reviewed every document in my reference folder, and arrived with a clear understanding of what I was and was not willing to do. The conference room they used was the same one where Ms. Hargrove had stopped me on slide 3 and told me my idea was unrealistic. Someone had put a water jug and glasses on the table, which felt like an effort. Miss Hargrove came in with Phil and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be their new chief operating officer. Phil looked at the table more than he looked at me. Miss Hargrove maintained her composure well, but when she said, "We may have underestimated your vision," she said it with the specific, careful phrasing of someone who has rehearsed a sentence for its minimum possible admission of fault. I looked at her steadily. I let the silence after her sentence sit undisturbed for long enough that it became slightly uncomfortable. Then I said, "Tell me what you need." Because I had learned, working in crisis situations, that the first move in a negotiation is always to make the other side articulate the problem they are asking you to solve. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I had written the consulting terms myself, with my solicitor's input on the legal language. The rate was high, genuinely high, the kind of number that made Phil glance up from the table. There was a project timeline with clear deliverables and a termination clause that protected me if the engagement was discontinued early. And there was one additional condition, set out in plain language in its own paragraph, formal written acknowledgement on company letterhead, signed by senior leadership, that the framework underlying Project Horizon had originated with me, that I had developed it independently, presented it to the organization in a proposal dated 7 months earlier, and that its core architecture reflected my original work. Not an apology. Not an admission of wrongdoing. Just the truth in writing signed. Ms. Hargrove read it twice. Phil read it once. The COO read it and then looked at Ms. Hargrove. There was a silence that lasted longer than any silence in that room had lasted before. Then the COO said, quietly but clearly, that he thought the terms were reasonable. Ms. Hargrove looked at him. Then she looked back at the paper. They signed 3 days later. Both documents, the consulting agreement and the written acknowledgement. I received the signed copies by courier, reviewed them with my solicitor, and filed them in the same folder where I had kept everything else. I did not celebrate. I did not post about it or tell many people. I went to work the following Monday and kept building what I was building at Orlin, where the client model was now being formally expanded to the full client portfolio and the licensing discussions with 2 external firms had moved to contract stage. On a Thursday afternoon, a Thursday which I noticed, I was in a strategy session with Nadia's team when someone mentioned that the trade press had started calling our client retention approach the new benchmark for mid-market logistics software. I sat with that for a moment. Then I thought about a specific word. I thought about the way Ms. Hargrove had delivered it, looking down at her notes, almost bored, as if she were doing me a courtesy by ending the conversation quickly. Unrealistic, she had been right in a way. What I had built, the equity I had earned, the acknowledgement I had secured, the benchmark the industry was now pointing at, none of it had been realistic. Not for someone they had decided didn't fit her role. Not for someone they had tried to quietly erase. It had only been realistic for me. And I had always been the only one whose opinion of that actually mattered.